Only Marines allowed past the ramp, sweetheart. No princesses, no tourists. Hands off the boat. Sergeant Wyatt Boyd said it loud, the way a man says a thing when he wants an audience to hear it, before he wants it understood. It was 0440 on a Tuesday in March, and the small craft waterfront was still the color of wet slate. The tide slapped the camels along the pier at a slow, even count, once every 3 or 4 seconds, and the patrol craft rode low on a slack mooring line with the fuel float creaking beside it. The air held diesel and salt and the cold iron smell of a pier that had not yet warmed. 2 of Boyd's crew laughed on cue. The woman he had spoken to did not. She stood at the head of the pier in civilian travel clothes, a dark quarter-zip and canvas trousers, a small bag at her feet, and she did not step back, and she did not step forward. She simply held still, and the stillness was the first thing about her that didn't fit. Most civilians who wandered a military waterfront at that hour fidgeted, checked a phone, looked for the exit. This woman's hands were quiet at her sides. Her eyes moved once across the length of the pier, from the fuel float to the boathouse hatch to the bollard at the far end. The way a person reads a page they have read many times before. And then her eyes came back to Boyd and stayed there. "You hear me?" Boyd said. "This is a restricted pier. You need to be up at the quarterdeck with the rest of the visitors." "I heard you," the woman said. Her voice was level and unhurried. "Your dewatering pump. What is it rated at? And when did this craft last run a full engineering casualty control drill on the water? Not pierside." The question landed and did nothing, because Boyd did not hear it as a question. He heard it as a tourist repeating words she had seen on a placard somewhere, the way people repeat the words on a museum wall. He grinned at his crew and spread his hands wide, playing the room. "Look at this. The pier inspector's here." The crew laughed again, louder now, and one of them turned to the whiteboard by the ramp and chalked something the woman could not yet see, and the laughter of a man who has an audience fed on itself and grew. Boyd was 24 years old, and he was, by the narrow measure of the thing he did, genuinely good. He could put a small craft alongside a pitching pier in a cross-current and step off dry. He had never been tested by anything larger than the weather, and he had come to believe that competence at one thing was the same as authority over everything, which is the oldest mistake a young man in a uniform can make. So he stood on his pier in the last dark of the morning, and he measured the woman by what she was wearing and by the fact that she had no badge, and he decided she was nothing. And he told her so with a smile, and his crew laughed because he was the sergeant. And laughing with the sergeant was the warm place to stand. The woman did not raise her voice, and she did not fill the silence, and she did not do any of the things a person does when a room turns against them. She waited until the laughter had spent itself, which took longer than Boyd expected, and then she asked her 2 questions again, in the same flat, exact order, as though the first asking had simply not occurred. The dewatering pump, its rating, and the last full casualty control drill on the water. "I don't know, ma'am," Boyd said, still grinning. "I'll have my people look it up for you and mail it to your hotel." More laughter. He had answered her at last, and his answer was that he did not know, and he did not hear that either. She had asked the only 2 questions that mattered. He had answered neither. 60 feet away, at the boathouse hatch, Gunnery Sergeant Emmett Thorne stopped with a coffee going cold in his hand and watched. He was 47 years old and had spent 29 of those years around boats and the men who ran them, and he had learned to trust the small wrong notes before he could name them. There were 3 wrong notes here. The woman carried no phone. Her watch was turned face inward on her wrist, the way a person wears it who does not want a glint to give away a movement. And she had no lanyard, no visitor badge, no logo on a single thing she wore, which meant either she had walked onto the waterfront the way no visitor could, or she was exactly the sort of person for whom the visitor process was an afterthought. Thorne set the coffee down on the hatch, combing, and did not drink it. The woman said nothing more. She wrote nothing down. She turned from Boyd while his crew was still laughing and walked the pier line, slow and even, and the gunnery sergeant found that he could not stop watching her go. She walked the waterfront the way a physician walks a ward, and in 10 minutes, without once touching a clipboard, she read the readiness of the whole detachment. She read it in the grounding cable on the fuel float, which hung 8 inches short of the deck, fitting it was supposed to bond to, so that a static charge during fueling would have nowhere safe to go. She read it in the fire station by the second cleat, whose placard said one thing and whose hose fittings were another, mislabeled so that a Marine reaching for it in the dark would lose 4 seconds learning it was wrong, and 4 seconds is a long time to learn a thing when a fuel fire is teaching it. She read it in the way the nearest patrol craft wrote at the stern, a hand's width lower than it should, which meant weight where there should not be weight, or water where there should not be water, and either of those was a question that deserved an answer before that boat went anywhere. She said each of these things aloud, quietly, to no one, in the exact nomenclature of a person who had spent a career on exactly these boats. A grounding cable 8 inches short, a hydrostatic release on the life raft 2 months past its service date, a dewatering discharge routed in a way that would foul under load. She did not say them with heat. She said them the way a person counts, and the counting was worse than heat would have been, because heat passes and counting does not. Thorne closed the distance and offered the neutral thing a senior enlisted Marine offers a stranger. "Ma'am, help you find someone?" "When did this company last run a full engineering casualty control drill on the water?" she asked him. "Not pierside," she said again. "On the water, with the craft underway and the pumps under real load, the way it fails when it fails for real." Thorne hesitated, and the hesitation was its own answer, because he did not actually know, not to the day, not to the month. And a gunnery sergeant who cannot answer that question about his own boats has just learned something about his own house. He had a good idea it had been too long. He had a better idea now that this woman already knew the answer and was giving him the courtesy of arriving at it himself. She moved down the pier and stopped at the fuel manifold, and without crouching, she named the thing wrong with it, a cross-connect valve safety wired in the open position when it should have been wired shut, so that a single careless hand could route fuel where fuel was never supposed to go. She did not touch the valve. She looked at it for the length of 2 breaths and said the valve number and the correct position, and moved on. And Thorne, following, checked the wire himself and found her right, and felt the pier tilt a little under him, though the tide had not moved it. He had walked past that valve every morning for a year. She had named it in the time it took to pass it. The woman did not press him about the drill. She only held still again, that same economy of motion, her eyes doing the walking her feet did not need to, and Thorne felt the cold certainty arrive fully formed. He had been writing up that stern, trim problem for a month. He had put it in 2 reports. She had found it in 90 seconds and had not needed a tool to do it. And she had done it while the sergeant called her a princess, and she had not once broken stride to defend herself, which told Thorne more about who she was than any badge could have. Boyd reappeared at the ramp, drawn back by the sight of the gunny talking to the tourist. "Gunny, she's been touching the boats," he said, half a report and half a complaint, enjoying himself. "You want me to walk her up to the quarterdeck?" Thorne looked at Boyd for a long moment, longer than the question deserved. "Square away your craft, Sergeant," he said. "Trim's off at the stern and you know it. Fix it before the sun's up." It was a small thing, a crack in the morning's joke, and Boyd heard it as the gunny being difficult before coffee. He did not hear it as a warning, because he had not yet been given a reason to hear anything as a warning, and men like Boyd learn late. The woman put a small check mark on a folded index card, the only paper she carried, against the exact stern trim problem Thorne had been fighting for a month, and the gunnery sergeant's cold certainty turned to something closer to dread, because he understood now that she was not finding new problems. She was confirming a list she had somehow already made. By 0600 the sun was up and the joke had a name. Someone had chalked it on the whiteboard by the ramp, where the woman could see it now. The Pier Princess, with an arrow pointing toward the head. Boyd staged a mock tour for his crew, sweeping his arm toward the latrine, as though it were the flag bridge of a carrier, bowing her toward it with exaggerated courtesy. "Right this way, ma'am. Mind the step. Very important facilities." The crew loved it. This was the best kind of morning, the kind where the work felt like a show and someone else was the fool in it, and the cold and the early hour turned into fuel for the thing instead of a reason to stop it. The woman let it run. She stood through the mock tour with the same unbothered stillness she had held since 0440, and she watched. What she watched was not the joke. She watched a fueling evolution begin on the far side of the float, without a proper fire watch posted, a nozzle in a fill, and no Marine standing by with an extinguisher and eyes on the deck. And she watched the grounding cable that was 8 inches short do its quiet nothing while fuel moved through a hose in the morning cold. She did not raise her voice. She noted it, the way she noted everything, without a phone, with nothing but her memory and one more check mark on the folded card, and the calm of the noting was the calm of a person for whom none of this was theoretical. Not every Marine on the pier was laughing. Lance Corporal Marco Bianchi, 20 years old, 4 months in the fleet, stepped out of the crew's circle without making a thing of it. He crossed the pier, held out a cold bottle of water, and said, "Low," so it would not carry. "Ma'am, mind the fuel lines. Safe paths behind the second cleat, not the float." He said it the way a decent young man says, a thing he has decided is right even when the room is going the other way, quickly, and without waiting to be thanked. And then he stepped back before Boyd could see him do it and fold him into the joke. The woman took the water. "Thank you, Lance Corporal," she said, and she read his name tape and kept it, filing it beside the check marks and the counting, in the same place she kept everything she intended to remember. Boyd caught the tail of it. "Bianchi giving the tourist a tour of her own?" he called, and the crew laughed, and Bianchi's ears went red, and he said nothing, because he was 20, and the sergeant had 100 small ways to make a week miserable. But he didn't take the water back, and he didn't laugh, and the woman marked that too. They believed she was the joke of the morning. She was, in fact, the reason 3 of them would remember this exact morning for the rest of their careers. One of them because it would end the man he thought he was. One because it would remake him, and one because it would be the first time anyone with the authority to matter had watched him do the right thing and remembered his name. If a story like this one has ever made you glad, there are still people who watch quietly and hold the line. Take 1 second and subscribe to Honor Tales. It costs you nothing, and it keeps stories like this one coming. The system, when it moved against her, moved the way systems do, politely, on paper, and almost fatally. At 0640, the duty section was told there was an unescorted civilian on the pier, and the duty section did what it was trained to do. A duty non-commissioned officer with a clipboard found the woman by the second cleat and asked her for identification and a sponsor. She gave a name, Salcedo, and a purpose, readiness inspection, and both of those were true, and neither of them was in the duty log because the inspection was no notice, and the team's formal arrival brief was not scheduled until 0900. On paper, at that moment, she was a woman with no badge, no pass, no entry on any list, standing on a restricted waterfront, claiming a purpose the log did not know about. On paper, she was a trespasser, and the paper did not care how still she stood. Boyd, when he heard it, volunteered at once. "I'll walk her off, Corporal," he said, and there was real pleasure in it, the pleasure of a man who has decided that a thing is finally going his way, and that the universe has agreed with his first assessment after all. No trouble. Happy to. The paperwork tightened around the woman like a slack line coming taut, and she let it. She stood still and let the process reach for its conclusion, gave them enough rope for the whole coil, and the stillness that had unsettled Thorne now looked, to the duty section, like the stillness of a civilian who did not understand how much trouble she was in. The duty non-commissioned officer was not cruel. He was doing exactly what the watch bill told him to do, which was to account for every person on his waterfront, and the woman would not, in the end, hold a single thing he did against him, because he was the one person in the whole affair who had behaved correctly. Thorne understood. He had stopped believing she was a civilian somewhere around the stern trim checkmark, and now he moved to slow the thing down before it did something that could not be undone. He stepped into the duty office and picked up the phone and asked the company office a direct question. Who exactly were the morning's visitors supposed to be? And was there a name on that list he ought to know before somebody did something the command would spend a year apologizing for? He was told to stand by. He stood by. Through the office window, he watched the duty non-commissioned officer produce a form and a pen, and he watched Boyd position himself at the woman's elbow like an usher, and he felt the specific helplessness of a senior Marine who is certain and cannot yet prove it. He thought about simply saying it out loud. "Stop, all of you! I think that is a senior officer." But he had nothing to point to. No badge, no name on a list, only a bearing and a memory he could not fully surface. And a gunnery sergeant does not halt a lawful process on a feeling. So he did the only thing the situation allowed. He stayed close, and he kept the phone line open, and he waited for the company office to call back with a name that would end it. The woman answered the duty non-commissioned officer's questions plainly and completely, and every answer she gave was correct, and none of it helped her, because the truth she was telling was a truth the log had not caught up to yet. Name. Purpose. Sponsoring authority. She recited an office and a schedule the young corporal could not verify without a phone call up a chain that had not opened for the day. She did not raise the pitch of her voice or lean on the answers, and she did not say the one sentence that would have ended it in a heartbeat, which was to state her rank, because she had decided a long time ago that a person who has to announce her rank to be treated decently has already lost the more important argument. So she let the corporal do his job, and she watched, from inside the process, the exact shape of a unit that had forgotten how to tell a threat from a stranger, and she filed that too, because it was the most useful thing she would learn all day. The duty section was one signature away from escorting the inspecting officer off her own inspection, and the woman with the folded index card watched the pen come out, and she let them reach for it, because she had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to see a unit clearly was to let it show her exactly what it did when it thought no one who mattered was looking. Thorne pulled Boyd aside off the record, in the lee of the boathouse where the crew could not hear, and tried to save him. "Sergeant, look at me." He kept his voice down, which for Thorne was itself a kind of alarm, because the gunny was a man who corrected Marines at a volume the whole pier could enjoy, and quiet from him was weather-changing. "If she is who I think she is, you walk away right now. You square that boat, and you say nothing else to her for the rest of your natural life. You hearing me? Nothing. Not one more word." Boyd almost laughed. "Gunny, she's a lost tourist. No badge, no pass, no name on the list. She's been touching the boats and talking like she read a manual once. He shook his head with the easy confidence of a man who has never once been wrong in a way that cost him anything he could not afford. You're spun up over a civilian. Somebody's grandmother took a wrong turn off the base tour. I have been doing this since before you could swim, Sergeant, Thorne said. And I am telling you, the way that woman stands is not the way a lost person stands. Boyd shrugged it off, the way 24 shrugs off 47, and went back to his crew. And Thorne let him go because he could not physically hold him, and because he was, at that moment, somewhere in 2009, chasing a memory he could not fully surface. A force reconnaissance package. An over-the-beach job on a coast that did not need a name. A boat that had come back through the surf line one man short. An element leader who never raised her voice, who had walked off the extraction craft soaked to the chest and said 4 words to the coxswain's platoon and then never spoke of it again. He had not been on that boat. He had been 2 piers over, a younger man. And he had heard the story the way the fleet hears its stories, second-hand and reverent and incomplete, told in the low voice men use for the ones who paid. He could not place the face on the pier against the name in the story, but the bearing was the same, the stillness was the same, the economy of a person who had already spent everything she had to spend and had decided afterward never to waste motion again as long as she lived. The woman was alone at that moment at the stern of Boyd's craft. She had crouched at the transom and run one hand along the dewatering discharge, following the routing by feel, and she had found the thing she had suspected from 60 feet away in the dark. The discharge was downstream, fouled, routed and partly obstructed, so that under real load, with the craft taking water and the pump straining against a following sea, it would back up instead of clear. It was the exact failure that sinks small boats. It was the exact failure that drowns coxswains. She held her hand flat against the cold aluminum for one breath longer than the inspection required, and then she stood, and her face did not change at all, which was the most frightening thing about it. The gunny knew. The sergeant would not listen, and the colonel had just put her hand on the one gap on that pier that was not a paperwork problem. It was a funeral waiting for a date. If you have ever wondered what makes a person walk a cold pier alone before dawn, instead of waiting for the 9 o'clock brief, stay with this one. The answer is in the next few minutes, and it is not what the men on that pier thought it was. Subscribe to Honor Tales, so the algorithm keeps bringing you the ones that end like this. To understand the woman on the pier, you have to leave the pier and go back 17 years to a night in 2009 and a stretch of black water off a coast that does not need a name. She was 29 then, and she was the leader of a force reconnaissance element, and the whole of her life had already narrowed to the thing she was good at, which was getting a small number of Marines onto a hostile shore and getting them off it again. She had chosen the water side of the Corps young and never left it. She knew small craft the way a musician knows an instrument, not as a diagram, but as a living thing with moods, and she had spent 1,000 hours learning what boats do when everything goes right, and the harder, more important hours learning what they do when everything goes wrong. The insertion had gone the way good ones go, quietly and without a story. It was the extraction that turned. The craft took water at the stern in the surf line, a following sea pushing over the transom faster than it should, and the dewatering system that was supposed to clear, it faltered under the load, the discharge backing up exactly the way a fouled discharge backs up, and the boat began to sit down in the water with an element aboard and a surf line still to clear. She remembered it in procedure, because procedure was the only way she had ever been able to hold it. Weight forward, element low and to the center line. Coxswain on the pump. She remembered the sea state in numbers, a 4 building to a 5, the swell running 6 to 8 feet, the water in the compartment rising past the ankle and then past the calf, cold enough to take the breath out of a man. She had run the checklist in her head with the surf line coming, and there had been exactly one thing that would keep the boat from going down before it cleared. And that one thing was a person willing to go into the flooded compartment and hold the pump by hand and keep the discharge clear while the boat took the surf. Sergeant Cole Vega, 26 years old, the coxswain, went down into the flooded compartment to do it. He held the boat level long enough for the element to clear the surf line and come off the beach into open water where the sea let go of them. The narrator will not describe what the water did in that compartment. The Marines who were there did not describe it either, then or after. It is enough to say that the element cleared the surf line, and the boat came off the beach, and Cole Vega stayed on the pump, and he did not come off the boat. She did not display the bronze star with the small bronze V they gave her for that night. It lived in a drawer, and it had lived in every drawer she had owned since, because a decoration for a night your Marine drowns at a pump is not a thing you pin on a chest and wear to a ceremony. What she kept instead was a rule, and the rule was simple and total, and it had governed every day of the 17 years since. Any boat under her eye would be ready. Not ready on paper. Ready on the water. Under load. When it fails the way it failed for Cole Vega. She inspected boats the way other people prayed, because she had already buried a Marine who died at a dewatering pump, and she had decided, standing soaked on a beach at 29, that she would spend the rest of her career making sure the next pump held. The woman Sergeant Boyd had called a princess had put a young Marine in the ground who died at a foul dewatering discharge. And she had found the same system, fouled the same way, at the stern of Boyd's boat that morning, in the dark, before anyone on that pier thought to ask her name. Boyd crossed the bright line at 0750, and he did it the way men like him always do, by mistaking a quiet person for a powerless one. He had had enough of the tourist standing at the stern of his craft, studying his boat as though she owned it, and he wanted her gone, and he wanted his crew to see her go, because a joke that does not end with the fool leaving is not a joke a man like Boyd can live with. He reached down and took the one thing she was holding, the folded index card with its small column of check marks, plucked it out of her hand before she closed it, and held it up like a confiscated toy. "What is this, notes? You writing us up, princess? Sending a strongly worded letter?" And then, to the delight of his crew, he flicked it out over the water, a flat sidearm throw, and it opened once in the air and landed flat on the harbor surface and began, slowly, to darken and take on the sea and sink. He had thrown the inspector's findings into the harbor. He did not know that. He thought he had thrown away a scrap of paper a lost woman had been scribbling on. Then he did the second thing, the worst thing, the thing that turned a bad morning into a documentable one. He signed the craft out. He walked to the log and put his name in it against the patrol boat, with the fouled, dewatering discharge and the low stern, and he told Bianchi to get aboard as crew, because he was going to take the boat off the Camel and out into the channel and show the tourist how Marines actually worked. The unsafe boat, the 20-year-old, the cold gray water past the breakwater. He did it to win the morning, and he did it in front of the one witness on the entire coast for whom an unsafe boat leaving a pier was not a policy violation, but a memory with a name on it. The woman moved then for the first time all morning, and the movement was so economical that half the crew did not register it as movement. She crossed the 6 feet to the Camel at the bow line, put herself between the boat and the open water, and said 3 words in a voice that did not rise and did not have to. "Hold the boat." The stillness that had unsettled Thorne for 3 hours arrived now at its full weight, and it was not stillness at all, it turned out. It was the compression of a person who spends motion the way a sniper spends rounds, one at a time and never for show, and who had just decided to spend some. The crew stopped laughing without deciding to. Bianchi, one foot on the gunwale, went still. Boyd looked at the woman blocking his bow line, and something in the back of his mind sent up a flare it could not explain, and he did the thing that would finish him. He ignored it. "Ma'am, this is a working boat and you are in the way," Boyd said. And there was an edge under it now, because the flare in the back of his mind had made him afraid without telling him why. And a certain kind of man answers fear with volume. "Step off the camel. Last time I'm asking nice." "The discharge on this craft is fouled," the woman said, and for the first time she gave him a specific and complete answer instead of a question, laying it out flat and exact. The routing, the obstruction, what it would do under load in a following sea. How many minutes a boat like this one had once it began to sit down at the stern. She recited it the way a person recites a thing they have lived rather than read. "You will not take a fouled boat and a junior Marine past the breakwater while I am standing on this pier. Hold the boat." Boyd heard the words and did not hear them, because he had already decided what she was, and a man who has decided what a person is will spend a great deal of credibility rather than change the verdict. He put his hand on the throttle. Bianchi, 1 foot aboard, looked between the sergeant and the still woman on the camel and did the arithmetic that a good young Marine does in a bad moment. And he took his foot off the gunwale quietly, and no one told him to. The woman looked at Sergeant Boyd, and for the first time since 0440, she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a person who has already decided how a thing ends and is only waiting for the other party to arrive at the same knowledge. 60 feet away, Thorne saw the smile and started moving toward the pier office at something faster than a walk, because he had seen that expression once before, on a different face, at a different water, and he knew it was not the beginning of an argument. It was the end of one. Boyd thought he had finally won the pier. He had just put an unsafe boat and a 20-year-old Marine into the water in front of the one person on the entire coast who would not, under any circumstances she would ever permit, allow it. Captain June Alvarado came down the pier at a fast walk with an orders folder under her arm, and she ended the morning with 2 words. "Colonel Salcedo." She said it while she was still 30 feet out, pitch to carry, the reflexive courtesy of an officer reporting to a senior she has been looking for. "The team staged at the quarterdeck, ma'am. My apologies. The boat brief ran long. I should have had you escorted from the gate." The word colonel landed on the pier like a dropped wrench on a steel deck. It did not echo. It simply stopped everything. The chalk on the whiteboard, the pier princess with its little arrow, sat in the new silence looking exactly like what it was, and one of the crew who had laughed loudest at it took a small step sideways, as though distance from the whiteboard were distance from the thing he had done. Behind Alvarado came Lieutenant Colonel Bennett Shaw, the detachment commander, 44 years old, who had come down to the water expecting to walk his inspecting officer through a squared-away morning, and had instead arrived to find her standing on a camel, holding a boat off the water by the force of 3 spoken words. Shaw came to attention and reported, the way an officer does to the head of a readiness inspection who outranks him and holds his detachment's grade in her hand. There was no formation. No one called the pier to attention. No mass of Marines snapped to and held a salute for a photograph. The authority was quieter and heavier than that. It was in the folder under Alvarado's arm, and it was in the 2 words the captain had used, and it was in the way the lieutenant colonel's spine had gone straight without a single order being given. Thorne, 1 beat behind, came to attention too, and something in his weathered face was almost relief, because the thing he had known for 3 hours and could not prove was finally, mercifully, true. And no Marine had been drowned to prove it. Sergeant Wyatt Boyd's face did the whole cycle in perhaps 4 seconds. First confusion, because the word did not fit the woman. Could not fit the woman, the tourist, the princess, the lost grandmother off the base tour. Then disbelief, an actual small shake of the head, the reflex of a mind refusing a fact it has already begun to accept. Then recognition, the fact arriving anyway, the tourist and the colonel collapsing into one person in front of him, the dewatering questions and the stern, trim check mark, and the 3 words that had stopped his boat all snapping into a single terrible shape he could not look away from. And then horror, plain and total, as he understood that every single thing he had done and said since 0440, the sweetheart, the princess, the mock tour, the notes into the harbor, the boat he had signed out to spite her, had been done in front of the inspecting officer and seen and logged and remembered. The colonel's first act with her rank showing was not to destroy the sergeant. She turned from Boyd as though he were, for that moment, the least important thing on the pier, and she spoke to Shaw and Thorne in the flat, exact voice she had used on the dewatering pump. That craft does not leave the Camel. Dewatering discharge is downstream fouled. It will back up under load and put the stern down. Get the lance corporal off it. Secure the boat. Tag it out of service. She let a breath pass. Then we will talk about the rest of it. Bianchi came off the gunwale, quick, and did not look at Boyd as he did it. Thorne had the tag-out chain moving before she finished the sentence, calling 2 Marines by name to secure the boat and hang the red tag. And for the first time that morning, the pier moved with the crisp economy it should have had at 0440. The transformation took perhaps 20 seconds. That was the thing none of them would forget. The ones who had laughed and the one who had not. How fast a slack morning became a squared-away one, the instant a real authority put weight on it, and how little that authority had needed to raise its voice to do it. Captain Alvarado held the orders folder out, and Colonel Salcedo did not even take it, because she did not need the paper to know what was in it. Lieutenant Colonel Shaw, still at a loss for how his morning had gone this way, began an apology, and she stopped it with a small lift of 2 fingers, not unkindly. Explanations later. The boat first. The pier that had laughed at the princess an hour before stood dead silent while the colonel secured the craft that would have failed in the channel, and Sergeant Boyd, standing where his crew had stood to laugh with him, found that the warm place to stand had disappeared entirely, and that he was alone in the exact center of a thing he had built himself, and that he finally understood who had watched him all morning, in the dark, and then in the light. She ran the inspection she had come to run, and the reckoning she brought was measured, which is a harder and rarer thing than fury. Colonel Salcedo graded the detachment honestly, and honest was not kind. The grounding cable 8 inches short went on the record and was fixed on the spot, a Marine on his knees with a wrench, while she watched and timed it. The mislabeled fire station was corrected before she left the second cleat, the placard pulled, the fittings verified by hand. The hydrostatic release 2 months past its date was pulled and replaced from the supply cage that should have replaced it 2 months before. And the foul dewatering discharge, the one that was not a paperwork problem, was tagged out of service across every craft on the pier until each one could be run under load, on the water. With the pumps straining, the drill this company had not done in longer than anyone in the chain of command wanted to say aloud. She wrote the gaps down where the whole chain would have to read them, in language that left no room to soften it later. The reckoning was institutional, it was not carceral, and it was not for show. And when it came to Sergeant Boyd, she did not do the thing the morning had earned him, which would have been easy and satisfying and small. She did not have him arrested. She did not convene a court-martial or open a formal investigation to end his career at 24 over a morning's arrogance. What she did was heavier, and it took longer, and it would follow him further. She entered a documented counseling in her own hand that laid out exactly what he had done: the mockery, the Firewatch gap, the notes destroyed, the unsafe craft signed out with a junior marine aboard, and she relieved him from the coxswain's seat pending requalification. And then, because she had watched him handle that boat all morning and had seen that under the swagger the hands were real, that he could actually run a small craft in a way most men never learn, no matter how long they serve, she gave him the harder mercy. "You are a good coxswain," she told him in the quiet after, and she let that sit, because it was true, and because he had braced for the opposite and didn't know what to do with the truth. "You are a good coxswain and a poor marine, and only one of those is fixable this morning. You will earn the seat back on the water, under the gunnery sergeant, to my standard, and you will run the casualty control drill until you can hold a flooding boat level in your sleep. Do you know why?" Boyd did not. He had no answer left in him at all. "Because someday your pump is going to fail with your crew aboard and a sea running," she said, "and the only thing standing between them and the water is going to be whether you took this seriously the day someone gave you the chance to." She did not tell him about Colvega. She never told anyone about Colvega, and she was not going to spend him on a lesson for a sergeant. But she made certain, in the counseling and in the drill she ordered, that the standard Colvega had died reaching for would live in the hands of the next young man who sat in that seat, and the one after him. Boyd, who had braced all morning for the thing that never came, and then been handed the thing he had not earned, did the only useful thing left to him, which was to say nothing and mean it. He did not argue. He did not perform contrition for the crew that was no longer watching. He took the counseling, and he took the relief from the seat, and somewhere behind his eyes, a slow and painful rearrangement began, the kind that a certain fortunate few young men get to have while they are still young enough for it to remake them. Whether it took was not a thing the colonel could control, and not a thing she pretended to. She had opened the door and named the standard, and left the walking to him, which is the most any honest mentor can do, and more than most are willing to. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne watched the whole exchange from a few feet off with an expression that was hard to read, and when the colonel finished, he came to a decision he had been circling for 3 hours. "Ma'am," he said, low, "there was a package, 2009 over the beach. A boat came back a man short. I was 2 piers over. I never knew the officer's name." He did not make it a question, because it was not his place to. The colonel looked at him for a moment, and something passed between them that did not need language, the recognition of 2 people who had spent their lives on the same water and paid at different prices. "It was a good boat and a good crew," she said, which was an answer, and was also the end of the subject, and Thorne nodded once, and never raised it again. If this story reached something in you, that is the whole reason the channel exists. Subscribe to Honor Tales, and let these Marines, and the ones like them, keep finding you. She found Lance Corporal Bianchi before she left. She told Lieutenant Colonel Shaw, in front of the boy, that in a morning when an entire crew had gone the wrong way, one Marine had shown a stranger courtesy, kept a fuel line safe, and stepped out of the joke when stepping out of the joke cost him something. That, she said, was the instinct that made a Marine worth the name, and it did not come from rank, and it could not be taught, and Shaw would do well to remember the young man's name. It was not a medal. It was better than a medal, at 20 years old. It was the memory that the first senior officer who ever watched him closely had watched him do the right thing, and had said so out loud where it counted. At first light the next tide, the patrol craft pushed off into the channel with their dewatering discharges clear, and Colonel Renata Salcedo watched them go from the head of the pier. She stood in the same spot where a sergeant had called her a princess and told her to keep her hands off the boat, and she watched the boats she had come to inspect run out into the gray water, the way boats are supposed to run, level and clean and ready. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne stood a respectful distance off, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed saying between two people who had both, in their own way, spent a career learning the same lesson about the same machines. She did not wait for the after-action brief. She had written what needed writing, and the detachment would read it, and the boats would be better for it, and that was the entire point, and the only reward she had ever wanted from the work. There was no coded greeting. There was no name whispered to a phone, no theater named, no wall of the dead, no message from a ghost. There was only a woman who had buried a Marine at a dewatering pump 17 years before, and who had spent every morning since making sure the next pump held, picking up a small bag from the head of a pier and walking away from a unit she had left better than she found it, asking no one to thank her. On the boat that led the column out, a young Marine ran the dewatering check the way the drill now demanded, by hand, out loud, calling each step to his coxswain, and the coxswain answered each one, and the discharge ran clear into the gray water. Neither of them knew why the colonel had stood at the rail of that same pier and watched them do it with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite peace. They did not know the name of the sergeant who had held a pump in a flooded compartment off a coast with no name 17 years before. They only knew the check and the drill and the standard, and that was enough, because that was the whole of what she had come to leave them, and it would outlast her posting and the next one and every pier she ever walked. She had come to see the detachment as it really was. She left it more ready than she found it, and she was gone before the sun cleared the boathouse roof, which was exactly the way she wanted it. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.